Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. This time we're going to turn an existing Windows installation on a physical computer into a virtual machine. This may be useful if, for example, you're migrating from Windows to Linux and you want to keep your existing Windows installation available. So, let's go and get started. Right, here we are in Linux Mint, where I've installed VirtualBox, which can be used to set up and manage virtual machines. And if we launch the program, we can see I've got lots of virtual machines installed, including Windows 11. So if we run this up, here we are running Windows as a guest operating system in Linux. And I demonstrated how to do this in a fairly recent video called Running Windows in Linux, a VirtualBox Guide, which I'll link in the video description. And in that video, we did a clean Windows install. But what if you want to turn an existing Windows installation into a virtual machine like this one with all your applications and data just as they were? Well, here we're going to do just this. Specifically, we're going to copy the Windows 10 installation on this HP EliteDesk 800 to this external SSD, before bringing it across to this machine running Linux Mint and setting it up in VirtualBox. The process will involve, first on the Windows PC, downloading an application called Disk to VHD, and then using it to create a VHDX virtual drive copy of the Windows installation. We'll then go across to our host Linux PC, where, with VirtualBox installed, we'll convert our VHDX file to the native VDI format used by VirtualBox, and then we'll use it to create our virtual machine. To get everything working properly, we'll then install VirtualBox Guest Editions, following which other configurations and activations may well be required. Greetings! We've now got the EliteDesk up and running, and if we go across to its desktop, we can see that it is indeed running Windows 10 with a few applications already installed on the system, so we can be clear this is not a clean install. And if we open up this PC, we can see that Windows is installed on a system drive with a formatted capacity of 465 gigabytes. Indeed, if we do a properties here, we can see that about 75 gigabytes of space is currently being used. And so we'll need roughly this amount of space to create a virtual disk copy of this system. As already noted, we're going to create our virtual disk copy on an external SSD, which is called Stanley and already plugged in. And as you can see, the drive is currently completely empty. So let's go across to Mr. Internet to visit this Microsoft page where we can download the utility called Disk to VHD, Disk to Virtual Hard Drive. And it's a very small utility, so we just click here to download like that, and I'll send it to my downloads folder. There we are, didn't take very long, tiny little file. And if we just go across to where I've got downloads, there it is. We just need to extract the files like that. We will extract here. There we are, and we don't need to actually install this program, we can just run the exe. And as you can see, there are various exes included, a 32-bit one, but also one for 64-bit systems. This is the one most people will want to run. So let's run it up. And Windows will check we want to do it. We do, and on first run, you'll see this message to accept the end-user license agreement, which of course we will do. And there we are, this is Disk to VHD. And it's very straightforward to use. You just have to tell it what you want to include in your virtual disk image, which here wants to be our C drive, anything else on the system disk, but we don't need what's on our plugged-in external SSD, so we'll get rid of D:. And then we'll go up to the settings at the top. We want to prepare for use in a virtual PC. We will tick that. We will leave Use Volume Shadow Copy unticked, and I'm going to leave here Use VHDX ticked. And I should explain here that if we untick this box, the system would create a VHD rather than a more modern VHDX virtual hard disk file. And the advantage of doing that would be that a VHD file can be used directly in VirtualBox, where we're going to be creating our virtual machine. However, VHD is not the native file format for VirtualBox, which is called VDI, Virtual Disk Image. And VHD is more likely to get corrupted than a VDI file in VirtualBox. And so what we're doing here is a slightly longer method of creating a VHDX file, which we're then going to convert to a VDI file for use in VirtualBox. And in my view, it's worth taking a little extra time to do this step to make sure we end up with a virtual machine that's less likely to get corrupted. Although I'm sure there were some people in the comments saying, simply untick this box, use VHD all the way through, you'll save a bit of time. You will, but it's not what I would personally recommend. Anyway, with all that explained, we need to set the location and the name for the file we're creating. We have a default here, but I want to change that. I want to go to our external SSD, and I think I'll change the file name to something more meaningful for me. That seems a pretty meaningful file. There we go. And so we can now click on Create. And as you would guess, this will take a little bit of time, so we'll now use the magic of filmmaking to speed on through. And there we are. The disk2VHD utility has now created a copy of our Windows installation. And if we just have a look in this PC and go to our SSD, there it is, look. And as we can see, if we adjust things here a little bit, the file for this particular Windows install is about 77 gigabytes in size. Right, here we are back in Linux Mint, where I've plugged in the external SSD containing our image of the Windows installation. And I've just noticed I called it HO Windows 10 VHDX. It should of course be HP, so let's just rename that file, or it'll annoy me going ahead. Doesn't matter what you call it, of course. You can call it blibbity blobbity blibbity if you wish, but I'm going to stick with this. As we saw earlier, I've also got Oracle's VirtualBox all set up, and there are various ways to achieve this, including using the software manager to install the base VirtualBox package, as well as the Guest Editions ISO, which will allow us to improve virtual machine functionality. And you may also want to install the VirtualBox extension pack to gain better support for things like USB 2 and USB 3 drives. Do note, however, that whilst VirtualBox itself is free and open source, the extension pack is offered under a personal use and evaluation license. Finally, note that before creating a virtual machine, you must turn on hardware virtualization in your computer's BIOS. Here, I'm going to assume you've got all this done okay, but if you do need some help, there are step-by-step guides in my previous Running Windows in Linux video. So let's now convert our VHDX disk image into the VDI format native to VirtualBox. We can do this using VBoxManage, which is the VirtualBox command line interface. So let's open up the terminal, and here I think we'll first navigate to the folder where VirtualBox disk images are stored. By default in Linux, this is a folder called VirtualBox VMs in Home. So let's do an ls for list, like that. We can see where it is. There we are, VirtualBox VMs. And as you can see, it appears in quotes. And the reason for that is because there's a space in the folder name. I personally don't like using spaces in folder names. I always use underscores, but here Oracle have used a space. And this means we have to use quotes when navigating to this folder in the terminal. So let's do a cd, a change directory to that folder, VirtualBox VMs, like that. And if we go and do an ls for list, we can see that there are folders inside this folder for all the different virtual machines on this system. If, for example, we change to the folder for Zorin OS 18, let's do a cd and Zorin, and I will just press the tab key to autocomplete and enter, and we do an ls there. As you can see, we have got a VDI file there for a Zorin OS 18 core. So let's go back to the previous folder level, like that. And to be tidy, let's create a folder, a directory, in which we're going to place our VDI file. So let's do an mkdir make directory, and we'll call it HP underscore, no spaces for me, Windows 10, like that. We just do an ls, we can see that has been created, there it is, and we will change to it, cd HP tab to complete, there we are. And just to keep this screen a little bit neater in the video, I'm going to do a clear like that, which looks a bit tidier. Next, the syntax for converting a VHDX or VHD file to a VDI file is VBoxManage, clonehd, path and source file, path and target file, and then finally the argument format VDI. The Windows VHDX file we created is currently sitting on our external SSD called Stanley. There it is. And to determine the path, let's go back to the terminal and do an lsblk, list block devices. And there we are, we can see the path there for that external SSD. It is media EC Stanley. And so I'm going to enter the command VBoxManage, then clonehd, and then media EC Stanley, and then the file name, the thing we've got sitting up here. And then the target file name, which is going to be same again, I think. Let's keep things nice and straightforward, but this time it'll be a VDI file. And then finally, we have the argument format VDI. Here, note, I don't need to enter a path for the new target file we're creating, as we've already navigated to the target location, which is where the file will be created. Also note that the source path and file names that you use will need to reflect your media and file name choices. So let's press enter and the process will run, which, as I'm sure you would guess, will take a little while. And so again, we'll use the magic of filmmaking to accelerate time. Note that there is no indication of progress here until 10% appears, and that things do seem to accelerate. Also note, if you want to learn more about how to work with files and paths in a Linux terminal, I've got a video about that too. Finally, I'd again stress that you don't have to perform a file conversion as we're doing here, as you can just create a VHD disk image of your Windows installation and then make a VirtualBox virtual machine from that, rather than converting a VHD or VHDX file to VDI. However, personally, I really think that the conversion step is worth the hassle, as the VDI format is native to and hence optimized for VirtualBox. And a VDI-based virtual machine is less likely to get corrupted than a VHD-based one if, for example, you don't shut it down properly. Anyway, as if by magic the process has now completed, here in about 10 minutes in the real world, and so if we do an ls, a list, there we are. Our VDI file has been created and is all raring to go. So, with the hard work completed, let's create our virtual machine. So we'll run up VirtualBox like that, and we'll go to New to create a new virtual machine. And here we need to put in a name. I'm again going to start with HP and Windows 10, but I wouldn't be able to use that name because that name is going to create a folder for this virtual machine. And if you remember, we've already got a folder for that virtual machine. Let's just go to Home and to the VirtualBox VMs. And you see we've got that folder there where we put our VDI file. And for the other machines here, they've got everything in one folder. Let's open, let's say, that other Windows 10. You see it's got its VDI file and its definition file and logs all in the same folder. And we can't do that here. I could have just placed the VDI file in the root of the VirtualBox VMs folder, but I think that's a bit messy. I'd rather have it somewhere it's nicely named. So we're going to have to give a slightly different name to our machine. Let's call it HP Windows 10 VM. That will do. And you'll see that by default, the version here will be a Windows 10 64-bit machine. Although you can change this here if you wish. You might, for example, have a Windows 11 virtual machine, a Windows 7 one, etc. But we'll stick with Windows 10. And normally on this screen, if you're creating a virtual machine via a clean install, you'd now have to select an ISO image. But we don't have to do that because we're going to create our virtual machine from our VDI file. So let's click on Next. And on this screen, we need to allocate some memory and processor cores to our virtual machine. I'll go roughly 50-50, about 8 gig of memory and half the processor cores on the system. And then, very importantly, because our VDI is an image of a Windows system on a machine with an EFI BIOS, I'm going to click Enable EFI. So let's now go to Next, where rather than creating a new virtual hard disk file, we are of course going to use our existing virtual hard disk file, the one we've just created. Let's click on the end there to pick it up. And as you can see, these are the ones that are on this system already attached to VirtualBox in virtual machines, but this is the one we've just created. So let's click on that and choose, and again, click on Next. And there we are. We've got our summary, everything looks okay, and we can click on Finish. And if you're expecting something exciting to happen, nothing exciting will happen until we launch our virtual machine. And so let's do just that. Let's double click it down there. And this will take a little time for the thing to sort itself out. You need to be a bit patient. But of course, we're not patient in a video. And so once again, we will speed on through. And here we are, arriving in our virtual machine, the copy of our physical Windows system that is now a virtual machine. Fantastic, isn't it? Let's just do a view and a full screen mode. It won't full screen straight away. Do we want our machine to be discoverable by other computers? Let's click no for that for now. And as you can see, we have managed to transfer our machine from a physical to a virtual setup. We've just got our menu there, everything seems to be working, and we can launch any applications that were installed on the Windows system. Next, with our virtual machine all up and running, let's optimize its display. Right now, even though we've selected full screen down in the VirtualBox menu, we're still running at a resolution of 1024 by 768. As we can see, if we go to Display Settings, here we are, we can see 1024 by 768 resolution with no opportunity to change it. And if we came out of full screen mode, back down to the VirtualBox menu and click again on full screen mode, we'll go back to a standard window mode, although if we here rescale this window, again we're limited to a 1024 by 768 display. So let's go back into full screen like that and sort this out. And the way we sort it out is to install some VirtualBox drivers called Guest Additions, which add some additions to our Windows 10 install as a virtual machine. So let's go down to the VirtualBox menu again, and it's worth pointing out your VirtualBox menu may be at the top depending on how you've got VirtualBox configured, but however it's configured, go to Devices and select Insert Guest Additions CD Image. And depending on how your Windows install is configured, this may autoplay, but if it doesn't, go to this PC, and we can now see the VirtualBox Guest Additions. If I double click that, it probably will autoplay. It has, so we'll click on Yes to allow it to make changes to the system, and then click on Next to allow things to continue. Defaults will be fine. We will just install. And there we are, our Windows 10 virtual machine is now blessed with guest additions. So we'll click on Finish, which will reboot it. And here we are back again, and if we're just a bit patient, there we are, the system has sorted itself out. And if we just go back to Display Settings, there we are, we're running at 1920-1080, which is the correct resolution for this full screen display. And if we go back to the VirtualBox menu and go to View and come out of full screen mode, there we are, that is fine. But also if we now rescale with guest additions installed, Windows 10 rescales itself just fine. Right. With our transplanted Windows virtual machine now working nicely here in Linux, I thought we should take a quick look around. Not least I want to open up this PC where we can see that our virtual C drive has exactly the same size as the drive we cloned it from. Although because our virtual disk image file uses dynamic scaling, it's only taking up the amount of space on a Linux system that's actually used. Another thing to point out is that if we go back to the computer we cloned this installer Windows from, we can see that Windows was activated. Whereas back here on the virtual machine, if we look under activation, we can see that Windows isn't activated. And this is because this copy of Windows is now running on different hardware. And it's worth pointing out, even if you create a virtual machine from a physical Windows install and run it on the same physical computer, it still won't be activated because the virtual hardware is not the same as the physical hardware, and therefore it's very unlikely indeed that Windows will remain activated. Now, whether you can reactivate Windows in the virtual machine will depend on your particular license. if the physical computer you cloned Windows from had an OEM license, as most computers will if you bought a computer with Windows on it, then the chances are you can't use that license to reactivate a virtual machine. However, if you have a full retail Windows license, you should be able to reactivate. Although do be aware you won't be able to use the license on both the physical machine and the virtual machine. So if you reactivate on the virtual machine, you'll deactivate the physical machine. In practice, for a lot of users, activating Windows on a virtual machine will require the purchase of a new license key. And in this context, it's worth noting that you can use a Windows 11 license key to reactivate Windows 10, but you must have the appropriate version. So for example, a Windows 11 Pro license key will be required to reactivate Windows 10 Pro, or a Windows 11 Home license to reactivate Windows 10 Home. It's also worth being aware that activation won't just affect Windows itself. If you have software installed, for example, such as Microsoft Office or the Adobe Creative Cloud Suite, in fact any software tied to your machine's hardware, then it will no longer be activated when you move Windows to a virtual machine. And it's also worth being aware that programs that relied on particular hardware on your physical system, such as a particular GPU, also may not work or work well in a virtual machine. In this context, it's worth closing your virtual machine down in a normal way like that, and then in VirtualBox going to the machine settings and going to display, where you can adjust the video memory allocated to the virtual machine, and also you can change its graphics controller, as well as enabling 3D acceleration, which, as we can see here, allows us to allocate more video memory. There are also many other things you might want to do to configure your virtual machine, for example, to share file space with your host system, here Linux Mint, and you may also want to give your virtual machine access to USB drives or other USB peripherals. And once again, as this video is focused on turning a physical Windows installation into a virtual one, I'm going to refer you to my previous video on running Windows in Linux if you want to do such things. Turning an existing Windows install into a virtual machine may help to ease the transition for those migrating from Windows to Linux. This said, licensing and activation are important considerations, and personally, I normally prefer a clean install when setting up a virtual machine. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I hope to talk to you again very soon.